Okay. So I want to start by saying one thing. This is going to be something of a dialogue. So in addition to the standard caveat we just got about being recorded, I'm expecting people to be interacting on this thing and describing their own experiences of trying to cook without a recipe, or sort of making it up as you go along, to put it that way. There are aspects of prepping for this class that were kind of interesting. We just moved into the house we're living in now about 2.5 months or so ago, and my medieval cookbook collection is not yet unpacked. So prepping for this class was, I was kind of doing a lot of it from memory, and I had to like kind of go back and look at some documentation I'd written for some things and say, oh yeah, that's where I got that information from. Things like that. But so as a result, I'm not really providing a whole lot of references. I'll be mentioning some things. If you're interested in getting your hands on some of the things I mention, you can reach out to me later and I'll tell you how to get the stuff. So I want to start out by saying what we are not doing, because there's a whole, there's a couple of ways of thinking about things that perhaps I'm stating the obvious when I lay these things out, but what we are not doing is going down the path of they had these ingredients, therefore they made this food. Okay, that's something that I thought had been kind of laid to rest, and then it keeps on cropping up again and again, and people argue in its favor vigorously. Say, oh well, they had chicken, they had carrots, they had onions, they had this, they had that, so they would have done this with it. Well, how do you know that they would have done that with it? So we are not going down that path. At least not directly down that path. There's some ways in which we can do that that can work, but we'll circle back to that later. I want to reference a class, I believe it was, that Ertatine taught a number of years ago, where she presented a recipe with one set of ingredients and said, this same recipe has some alternative ingredients. Can you guess what they are? We're not doing that either. Okay. We're not saying there's an existing recipe. What would be the alternative ingredients that the author of the recipe themselves has proposed? If I recall correctly from what Ertatine said at the time, and what she's said it time to time again, is nobody got it right. It was an interesting exercise. Another thing that we are not doing, although it's a very interesting process, is there's a whole end of study of medieval foods that involves, or historic foods that involves getting your hands on pots and pottery and cookware from archaeological digs, doing analyses of what you find in those pots, and making your best guess as to what was cooked based on what you find in the analyses of the deposits. So you might say, okay, so this pot has olive residues in it. It has this residue. It has that residue. Therefore, let's extrapolate and guess that this kind of dish was prepared in this particular pot. Again, that's something that I tend to look at and say, that's an interesting exercise, but it tends not to account for the fact that the same pot might have been used for multiple different dishes, each of which added its own interesting deposit, and who knows whether what you're getting is what was actually cooked in the thing. So one of the things I want to spend some time talking about that, or use as sort of a basis, is a focus on technologies and similarities to other recipes. You know what I mean when I say technologies, using the same types of cooking vessels, using the same types of heat sources, things of that sort. You know, going down that path, because there's a certain set of limitations that you end up putting in place by following those sorts of rules. As I've been sitting through 2 or 3 classes prior to getting ready to teach this one, one of the things that I've heard reference to is the types of cooking techniques that were used. I mean, Ken Albala referenced a couple of them. The idea of you do one thing and then another thing. So you boil something and then you roast it, or you boil something and then you fry it, or you start something with a little bit of water and some oil and use the water to cook the thing. That water renders down. Now all you're left with is the oil, and it automatically switches over into frying. So that you see that sort of thing in some of the recipes. So there's the whole technology thing that we want to be thinking about as well. And the final preliminary comment that I want to make is that the sort of thing we're playing with here is not really entry level type of cooking. Okay, it requires a type of familiarity that comes with a fair bit of research and experimentation before you end up heading down this path. So what I want to start with as an example of inventing a recipe is a fairly basic level that is more of a modification of an existing recipe. So in the collection, Medieval Arab Cookery, you know, that collection came out a number of years ago from Prospect Press, edited by Charles Perry and others. There's a collection of essays by Maxime Rodenson. One of those essays was actually referenced in Ken Albala's talk just a little bit ago, the Mamunia East and West. One of the things that, well, I'll start by asking, how many of you are familiar with those essays?
No.
We have some people that have seen those things, so you kind of know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, not knowledgeable.
100% unfamiliar.
Okay, so what he talks about is how there are all these recipes for particular dishes from the medieval Islamic corpus of cookbooks, and he lists several specifically. One is and these are all stew type recipes, you know, sort of main dish type recipes. One is a recipe that's flavored with sumac, you know, referred to as sumakia. Another one is flavored with lemons, referred to as limunia. Another is a recipe that's flavored with pomegranate, rumania. So all these are, you know, sumac are the Arabic words for sumac, lemon, and pomegranate. So his observation is that, so you have all these recipes that you find in North Africa, further east in the Baghdad and Baghdadi area, you know, Syrian, all those sorts of areas. These recipes are standard. You find multiple versions of them across multiple cookbooks. So now the interesting thing is that you cross the Mediterranean and you start seeing the same recipes. Okay, you know, made with sumac, made with sour pomegranate, made with lemon. Okay, but they've been changed slightly to reflect the differences between availability of ingredients, the difference in technologies, and the difference in cultural and religious restrictions or lack thereof. So, for example, is anybody aware of what the primary cooking technologies, they're like, what kind of pots they used in the Middle East and in North Africa? You know, what do they use? They use metal pots, they use clay pots, they use stone pots. What do they use?
Clay, wasn't it? Like tagine?
Say again?
Clay pots like tagines?
Yeah, clay pots. There was a fair bit of that. Actually, the further west you go, the more clay you find. As you head east, you find something else. There's a fair bit of soapstone cookware. And in fact, the Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen, the author of that work, specifically states that the best thing you could possibly cook something in is soapstone. I have cooked in soapstone, and by golly, he's right. That stuff is amazing to cook in. It holds heat well. Everything cooks very, very evenly, and you take it off the fire, and it stays hot for like an hour afterwards because it's stone, man. It holds the heat. So that has an impact on how things would work. What happens when you go into Europe? Well, there's still a use of pottery, but you find more use of metal cookware. So copper pots, you know, iron pots, and so on and so forth. There's one very, very sharp difference that you'll find. So what kind of fats are they cooking in the Middle East and in the Islamic world? You know, what are the cooking fats or oils that they would be using?
Lamb's fat, if I recall correctly.
Anybody?
Lamb and sheep.
What was that? Did somebody say?
Lamb and sheep.
Lamb and sheep, yes. They'd be using the tail fat.
Correct.
You know, which I have used. It took some real effort to score some lamb tail fat, but it is available if you look around for it long enough and hard enough. And also they'd be using, you know, the vegetable oils like olive oil, sesame oil, a few others. So you cross the Mediterranean, and now you're into, you know, southern France, you know, Italy, you know, that entire range of things, maybe a little further north. What cooking fats and oils are they using there?
I would think olive oil would be the favorite.
Yeah, they do use some olive oil, but often what they're using is lard and bacon fat. Okay. So there's something that changes almost immediately, is the whole lard and bacon fat thing. Also, you know, remember what I mentioned earlier about using materials other than clay. So about 11 or 12 years ago, I was reading through all these essays by Rodenson and saw this and thought, you know, there's these recipes I see repeated in many different Islamic cookbooks. There's a particular kind of recipe called a Zerbaja. It's usually made with some form of poultry, almost always laced with saffron. It's because it's supposed to be yellow. It's supposed to be like this sort of golden yellow color. It has a lot of the sweet and sour action going for it. Which is fairly common in the medieval Islamic cookery. And I did a fair bit of research to see if there was anything that was similar by name, similar by ingredients, similar by, you know, what sort of thing you were doing with it, to see whether there was anything like that in Europe. Okay. There was not that I could find. they may well have prepared the thing, but they did, nobody documented it. Okay, unlike the ones that Rodenson mentions, the Sumakia, the Limunia, and the Rumania. So I decided, well, I'd like to try and guess what this would have been like if it had been cooked on the other side of the Mediterranean, so to speak. But before I did that, I felt I needed to thoroughly familiarize myself with what a Zerbaja, because that was what I was working on, what a Zerbaja really was. So I must have cooked about 15 or 20 different Zerbajas based on about 6 or 7 recipes. I just would, took like 2 or 3 recipes out of Al-Warak, Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen. I think there was one that I pulled out of the Anonymous Andalusian Cookbook. There was one from Ibn Razin, also North African. And I think I got one out of a Syrian cookbook as well. And I cooked those things several times. What did that do for me? It gave me a fairly intimate familiarity with what these things were supposed to be like, what they were supposed to taste like, if they were cooked, from the perspective of the original authors, so to speak. So here you go. You got all these foods, and you have the Crusaders or what have you coming home and saying, "No, I ate this stuff that was really good when I was warring for the church in the Holy Land, and let's see if we can do it over here." And that's what I tried to do. So what was the perspective I was coming from there when I tried that? I was coming from it with a familiarity, with something that I had sort of lived inside of for a while. So I understood the recipe fairly well. I was attempting to replicate something that happened with a number of other recipes, but to the best of my knowledge, hadn't happened with this particular recipe. So what were the main things I did? Well, one of the observations that I made was that a lot of the European recipes used milk or milk substitutes, so either milk or almond milk. So I thought, okay, well, I can do the almond milk thing, and I made my own almond milk. See, what else do they do? Well, they did cook in bacon grease. Now, this was a little bit of a non-starter for me because we keep a kosher household. So I thought, okay, well, what's my workaround on this? By the way, if I were to do this now, I would do it differently. What I did then is I got turkey bacon, fried it in, I think, safflower oil, and used the now flavored safflower oil as a substitute for bacon fat. I don't think it was a very good substitute. My observation is that it really did not pick up a lot of the flavor. Were I to do this now, what I would probably do is I've managed to score a source for duck bacon. I'd use that because that way I'm getting this very rich, meaty flavor in the fat that that would have been absent in the original Zerbaja. The only meaty flavor that you would have been getting would be the meaty flavor of the chicken. Okay? But the sort of flavor you get from using a mammalian fat like like lard or a bacon fat, duck fat actually comes pretty close to that. Have people here cooked with duck fat? Have you had the experience of doing that? I know somebody doing something like goose grease. Yes, that is something I considered at the time. Unfortunately, at the time, I did not have a source for goose grease. I have since intentionally gone and gotten a goose, cooked it, and siphoned off about the cup and a half of the fat from the stuff. And I'm using it very judiciously.
Yeah, if I may interject, we do a goose every Christmas.
Mhm.
We have goose grease literally left over from this past Christmas and the Christmas before.
I would with pleasure use some of that stuff.
We'll talk.
Um,
I'm just
yeah.
across the river from you.
Yeah, I am aware. Actually, a side story here. I was at the Union Square Green Market about a month or so ago, and there's a booth there that specializes in duck-related products. So I got myself some duck bacon ends, and while I was there, somebody came there and cleaned them out of every duck leg they had and every bit of duck fat that they had. And I sat there watching and thinking to myself, somebody's doing a serious confit feast. I wish I was invited. So, because you can tell from the ingredients. By the way, do people know what a confit is? What you do is you take the duck, you immerse it in the fat, and you cook it very, very slowly. Very, very rich, delightful thing to do. So anyway, so this was the experiment that I did. Is I used the almond milk, which would not have been used in any of the Zerbajas that I found that were extant in the medieval Islamic cookbooks. I used the fake bacon fat, and the other thing I did is I cooked it in an iron pot. Now, this was one of the most interesting parts of the experience because the particular Zerbaja that I was cooking was one that actually did not have any saffron in it. It got its yellow color from pureed quince. Okay, so it had this lovely, very light yellow tone to it. And the quince just added some fascinating layers of flavor to it. As I was cooking it in an iron pot, I watched as it turned from that lovely shade of yellow to this sort of ugly gray. Yeah. Because the acid in the mix was reacting with the iron, and it just started. It tasted fine. It just looked ugly. So this was a learning experience for me in a couple of ways that I've mentioned, but it was a good experience because it enabled me to transfer some of the knowledge that I had from having played around with this one particular recipe over to some other things. So the basis for being able to create a recipe without one existing is having a pretty good intimate knowledge of what it is that people ate and how the other recipes work. That's why I said towards the beginning, this is not something you want to do early on in your experience. It's something you want to spend spend a few years playing around with some of these recipes and getting yourself familiar with them. Now, I know that there are some people who are sort of cooking naturals. One of my sole apprentice is one of these people that's a cooking he's a genius. I took him as an apprentice not because I expect him to learn from me, but because I want to learn from him. So he kind of knows all this stuff. He just knows it. But for most of us, you sort of have to play around with the foods you're trying to emulate over a period of time and get to know how they work. I have a pretty solid confidence in myself that I can emulate something that would be eaten and appreciated in, let's say Al-Andalus or North Africa, in Il Maghreb. I have a pretty good confidence I could do the same for further east, for the Baghdadi. I have a pretty good confidence that I can make the distinction. I can make foods that would be, that somebody from what's now the Iraq, the Baghdadi area, would say, well, this tastes pretty good, but it's not quite like what we have at home because it's from North Africa, and vice versa. But it took me years to get to the point of being able to do that. I familiarized myself with the technologies. I familiarized myself with the flavors that were unique to each area. I familiarized myself with the foods that were unique to each area. What else? Yeah, I just kind of lived with those foods for a while. This is not something that I would feel confident. I wouldn't feel confident about trying to synthesize something out of, let's say the Menagier or Form of Curie or any of those, because those aren't cookbooks I'm familiar with. I just know they exist. I've almost never cooked anything out of any of those cookbooks. But set me in a kitchen with a range of spices and with the appropriate cookware and other cooking technologies, and with the ingredients that would be appropriate for the time of year. Because again, we're dealing with seasonality here. Seasonality is less of a thing for us in the 21st century, but we have to remember it was a thing then. And I could look at something and say, okay, well, it's winter, it's getting on towards the end of winter. Lots of root vegetables I'm going to be involved with here, things that have kept well, maybe maybe some cabbagey type things, those were available. They did play with those a bit. I've got the whole grains that would be available as well. What meats would start becoming available? It's a little early for the lambs. I remember, one of the entertaining things that my wife came across in her Passover researches was, when did they decide to insert an extra month in the Jewish calendar? When the lambs are too scrawny for them to be good for the Passover offering. Yeah, lambs are too scrawny. We better stick in an extra month. So, yeah. So that aspect of seasonality. So I have a confidence I can do that, but it took me a while to develop that. So, what I want to do at this point is sort of let people talk about their own experiences of trying to do this, of trying to, okay, I have a kitchen full of ingredients. What can I do that would be that I think would be recognizable by a 14th century German? Okay. What can I do that I don't have a recipe for? How can I produce something like this? So at this point, I kind of want to throw this open and have other people, comment on their own experiences.
I can comment a little bit on this subject. Mostly the flavor profile that I've been working on is similar to what you've been working on as well, with the North African, the Al-Andalus, those sorts of flavor profiles, just because those are the ones that are more similar to the Southwestern cooking, strangely enough. But there's
not
a lot
strangely
of
at all. No surprise at all. But yeah,
there's definitely a crossover between Southwestern cooking, Mexican cooking, and Iberian cooking, and it makes sense. I mean, colonization and all. So I'm a lot more comfortable with that, but that also has been a long time coming. We definitely, at least in the Outlands, we had a tradition of siege cooking, which is basically here's some random ingredients, go forth and make something good. There was not necessary ever a point that said, and you have to make it period for a particular time frame or whatever, but usually the cooks that were involved would make things that they know, would work with flavor profiles that they know. So we would do, they would hand us a chicken and we would make it in a style that is, Andalusians rather than trying to do something else. But again, like you said, that came from years of experience. And, we started our cooking in the SCA with form of curry and, take 1,000 turnips or take 1,000 eggs rather, and working on very much more European, Western European, and Northern European food flavor profiles. And so I'm working for the same. I'm working towards learning the more Scandinavian food flavor profiles from an earlier period. Again, that whole trying to be able to know, can I do this, rather than working from specific recipe books, because a lot of it is there isn't any. But we definitely have done basically redaction parties where we'll take something like Charles Perry, which has a list of ingredients and of course, how this all goes together, and then come up with, well, how would you put that together, knowing what you know about cooking?
Yeah, I've done that on occasion myself. One of the things that I didn't mention, and this is going to vary depending on which part of the world's cookery you're playing around with, is, the whole food is medicine side of the business. So you've got the humoral practice, which was much more of a thing in the Middle Eastern, Islamic world. It made its way into Europe and made its way quite a ways north. But then when you start getting into the Scandinavian type of cookery, well, now you're into sort of Norse herbalism type of thing. They're not thinking so much about the balancing the humors and that, and that's not the framework that they're working with. If you move further east, then you start bumping your head against the Ayurvedic type of approaches, which has effectively 3 humors rather than 4. You start moving even further east, now you get into the Chinese herbalism that you're playing around with. They're all trying to do this play this sort of balance game, because that sort of went with the whole way of thinking from half a dozen or more centuries ago. But you kind of got to know that and have some awareness of that. One of the most fascinating challenges that I took up, we used to have this, it was an open challenge event. And one of the challenges that was tossed out there was, it was "Help me, Dr. Galen, you're my only hope." And people who are participating were given, okay, so here are 4 people. Here's descriptions of their temperaments without saying what their temperaments are. All you have is a description. This is the season of the year. This is the location. Okay. So how are you going to cook a meal that will be healthful for all of these people? That was an interesting experience. And I've taken it and I've thrown it out there as challenges to other people. Friedrich, I believe you started to take me up on that one at one point.
I wanted to take you up on it. It was when you released the descriptions of the people's humors, I had hit a point at work and I was sick, where work had exploded and I was sick at the same time, and it just
that doesn't work.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work. But yeah, this is part of the exercise, is understanding not just the foods and the flavors, but understanding, oh, no, you really don't want to eat that. That's not good for you. No, it's fine for her over there, but you shouldn't eat that. You're a little too choleric in your temperament. This is better for somebody who's sanguine. Yeah. So having that degree of familiarity with not just the foods, but the but the perceived medical impact of the foods as well, is part of the game, so to speak. Let's see. Look, somebody's talking about getting a soapstone baker at a Korean grocery store. Oh, somebody was asking about source of soapstone pots. I got most of mine from Brazil. I have a Brazilian daughter-in-law, and so I got a source. But there are some places in the United States where you can buy them, but they're expensive as hell. Like a 2-3 quart pot probably cost you about minimum $150 or so, $100 to $150, which I suppose is not horrible, but still not cheap. Are they very fragile? Sort of initially, yes. After you cook with them for a while, no. But you do have to treat them gently. You can cook over direct heat. I routinely cook in the things over a charcoal brazier, which is very direct heat, but it's also very, very even heat. If you're going to cook on a stovetop, which you can do, get yourself a good quality flame tamer or heat distributor. Recently, I got myself there's this one company you can get copper slabs from. So I got myself a copper slab as a heat distributor. Useful item. 3-quart baker, 50. That's a very good. Does it have a lid? Asking Lynn T. Oh, very good, very good. I'll have to look around for that thing. There's a Facebook group called Cooking with Clay, and I hang out on that group and interact with them from time to time. But it's very, very heavily focused on the American Southwest. So it's a lot of cooking of beans and sort of Tex-Mex type food. There's a little bit of looking at more international type of cuisines. But one of the things about the focus, they talk a lot about the what are called chamba cookware, things that are made with micaceous clay. One of the things that I learned, actually one of the past cooking symposium, might have been last year or the year before, is that the micaceous cookware isn't something that was available in the old world. They used other ways of making the clay very refractory. So there's a sort of a different approach there. But that's one of the ways in which you can get your hands on some cookware. And I mean, you can spend the money and commission something to be made. I've done that a time or two. It can be a valuable way of doing things, but I've also managed to find some pretty good materials that work quite well for cooking in, just by keeping my eyes open and visiting my local ethnic grocery stores. I do have the advantage of living in the New York City area. I have Turkish grocery stores. I have Middle Eastern grocery stores, South Asian grocery stores, and Afro-Caribbean grocery stores within half an hour of me. So that tends to make it easy for me to acquire some of the technologies to play around with, as well as a lot of the ingredients that would be more difficult to get. Oh yeah, H Mart. I have heard very good things about that. One person I know did a Roman feast in which he needed sow's uteri, and the H Mart could provide him with sow's uteri, sow's uteruses. The Roman feast included stuffed sow's uteruses right out of Apicius. It was pretty impressive. Yeah, I remember asking him, "Where did you get these?" And he says, "Oh yeah, H Mart." So, anybody else's experiences of trying to do this kind of thing? Pig's ears, yeah. I mean, I want to hear stories of what people have tried, because we learn from each other's stories in this game.
The tricky thing for me is I'm afraid I used the techniques you said you didn't want to talk about.
Okay.
I do Viking, 10th century Viking. There
Mhm.
are no written recipes. The best we can do is that we notice mentions of food occasionally in sagas or in myths. Yes, the whole business about what you find in the bottom of a pot. In the Norse case, part of what we were looking at was what flavor profile is an interesting point. And Daniel Serra, who's one of the writers of an early meal, thinks that their major interest was sour. And part of that is because of all the need to pickle. In a culture where it is literally so cold, there is no fresh produce for 5 to 6 months out of the year.
Yeah,
you
no,
have to do something or you'll die of scurvy.
Yeah, and I'm aware of that method. And I've eaten meals that were prepared that way. There's a there's a cooking group here in the East Kingdom that goes through various cookbooks, and one of the ones they went through was an early meal, and they prepared a feast based on that. And that's part of what they had to play around with, is just what you're describing.
Right, and part of what was so wonderful about it is they categorized foods not just by the time period, but by the location they were found in. What one eats in the north of Norway is going to be different than what you eat in Denmark or England, even though you might be a Norseman. Because of what
Well, part of it is that
was
the
available.
Norsemen
And a lot
really
of
got
the
around.
group that I'm doing is doing right, Norse under the Danelaw. So
Yeah.
we're in England. And because of that, if the Saxons had it, we figure we might too. But again, the Norse ate fish to an enormous extent, which we know from archaeology, compared to the Saxons, who really didn't eat it. They had eels, and that was considered desperation food.
Yeah, yeah.
And somewhere around the year 1000, they started cooking fish because a particular saint told them how to fish. That's the myth. The saint observed, God told the saint how to fish, and I kind of think he probably saw some Norsemen using nets, is my guess.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
And then we get in all of the laws about not eating meat certain days of the week, which weren't really a thing until about that time.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the other things that talking about that part of the world is the grains that they ate. The further north you get, the more likely you're going to be seeing the grains begin to shift from the certain varieties of wheat begin to recede. You see more rye, perhaps. My recollection is that oats were eaten in the British Isles, but they weren't eaten so much in other places. So you get this whole thing with the cereal grains that vary depending on where you are in the world.
Mhm.
and vary
Absolutely.
a lot depending on where you are in the world.
I've lived in true winter where there's 3 months of snow on the ground, and I'm now in Southern California, and I have to keep reminding people they could not have eaten that because they could not have grown it, or you simply can't eat that because you can't have it this time of year.
Yeah,
The
and-
seasonal aspect to it becomes very extreme.
yeah, and that's one of the things that you really do have to be aware of. That okay, it's spring. Hey, guess what? You got some green vegetables, but you're limited in terms of the green vegetables that you have. Again, referring to some of my wife's experiences of working with Passover related foods in Central Europe. Certain types of wines were kind of difficult to get. Grapes didn't grow well there. Central and Eastern Europe. So what they do? They made wine with raisins. He figured out how to make raisin wine. You have to be thinking about this whole what is available where, and again, what did people eat? And I like your mention of they ate lots of sour food because they did a lot of pickling. Well, one of the things that I noticed fairly quickly when I first started playing around in the medieval Islamic food sandbox, shall we say, was, wow, these people really liked their sweet and sour, didn't they? And they did. Anything you could possibly imagine that would add a sour flavor, and that would be balanced with a sweet flavor, they did. They had vinegar flavored stews. They had I mentioned the sumac flavored, the lemon flavored, pomegranate flavored. I've done 1 or 2 really marvelous orange flavored stews using Seville oranges. Now you got to have someplace where you can score some Seville oranges. They're not all that easy to find sometimes, but that was pretty awesome stuff. One point I was fortunate enough to get my hands on a citron that had enough pulp that I could actually get some juice out of it. Because oftentimes citrons are very, very thick skinned with very little pulp. So yeah, but are citrons going to be available anywhere other than Southern Europe? Probably not.
Another aspect to consider too is it's a little harder to figure out in the old days, but what texture is popular in a culture? And that's a little harder to figure out because it's rarely pointed out, like sometimes fried until crisp or heat until soft might give you some ideas, but
Yeah.
for instance, in the US, the biggest way to market something is to say that it's crunchy. Whereas in Japan, it's to say that it's slimy.
Interesting.
Noodles.
Yeah. One example of that is there's a type of dish that was part of the medieval Islamic world called a therid, and basically what it is it's a soup or a sort of a thin stew that's served over pieces of broken bread, and the broken bread is a flat bread, and you have to be able to, the bread has to be baked in such a way that it crumbles easily. So that's an insight into the type of texture you're going for. This is not something where you can say, oh, I'll just substitute pita for it. No, you can't do that. Pita isn't the right kind of bread. Okay, and I actually ended up having to make the bread that they were talking about. I have to figure out how to do this thing. And it is a very nice flat bread, but it's not pita, and it's not like a South Asian naan either. No, it's this bread. It's almost like it's almost like a pancake done to the point of turning it into a cracker. So, but it's a raised bread at the same time. It's a sourdough bread at the same time. So, these are your comment on texture. That's very relevant. One of the interesting things that Ken Albala referenced, made a comment about, was the chicken dish, slightly sweetened, and he was talking about how, well, what's the texture like? It's like chicken McNuggets. Anybody who sat in that class, do you remember him commenting about that? Yeah. So you've got a flavor combination and a texture combination going on at the same time. You take slightly sweetened chicken, which doesn't immediately register with us, perhaps. And also we've got that texture thing going as well. Okay, yeah, so cook enough. Yeah, what does that mean? Yeah, well, I mean, like, that's people ask me how to cook modern stuff. I said, well, you cook it till it's done. How do I know when it's done?
That was a throwaway line from our keynote earlier today, where he was talking about a lot of these books are manuals for folks who already know how to cook, so they give a description and say, oh, it's like this, which there are no recipes for, because everyone knows how to make one of those.
Yeah,
and instructions to cook until it's done.
Yeah,
Great, thanks.
the cookbooks are they're aides de memoire. They do not give you all the details, or very few give you all the details, and you're expected to know what you're doing.
That's
Yeah, you
that's
really don't
also
get that until it's beaten.
that's also how your grandmother cooked, though. How do you know when it's done? It's just done. How much do you put in? Enough.
Yeah, it is that, and that's a telling comment, that there's an expected skill level. Okay, and your grandmother saying that, she's communicating it, looking at it in the old days. Well, my daughter cooked with me, and my granddaughter cooked with me, and they just learned how to do this.
Yeah.
What's the big deal? One of the things I taught myself how to do in terms of Middle Eastern cookery was how to make couscous. How did I do it? I watched videos of North African grandmothers making couscous. And as I was watching those videos, I saw they had 2 generations working with them to do the job. They had their daughters and they had their granddaughters working with them to do the job. So I said, I would gladly be a daughter or granddaughter in the midst of your kitchen to learn how to do that as well as you're doing it. So, okay, I got a message saying we need to wrap things up.
We've got 7 more minutes.
Oh, we do have
So,
7.
We have 7
Okay.
minutes till it ends. So we're at 4:53
My
right
watch
now.
is fast.
Yeah, we're at 4:53 right now.
Okay, good. Ingredients might not be available, and now you have to substitute. Are you saying the ingredients might not be available like forever anymore because whatever the source of the things was either A, we don't know what the ingredient is, or B, the ingredient's extinct? Is that where we're going with this, with Elevice? Okay.
Yep.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. At a grandmother report. Yeah, as you say, as you cook together. So
Hello.
hello. So yeah, substituting. Yeah, you can do your best guess, but I try really hard not to substitute. I mean, like, and yeah, it is true that, you know, some things are just plain hard to get, or they're not available in one way or another. But I put in some pretty strong efforts not to use a modern substitute, if I can avoid it. You know, one of the comments that you know, a couple of us, you know, I made initially, and a couple other people chimed in with Ken Alballa's presentation, as we were talking about how chickens are so different now from what they were 30 years ago. 30 years ago, 40 years ago. You know, chickens nowadays, what I would say is that modern chickens are mutants. Okay. They're so breast heavy they can't walk, literally. You know, they fall over because they're so massive, because they've been bred to produce lots and lots of white meat. The typical the typical fryer, they're called, that you buy in a grocery store, weighs between 5 and 6 pounds, sometimes even more. When I was growing up, it was unusual to find a chicken that weighed more than 4 pounds. They were often less than 3. You know, one of the observations that I've made about vegetables is that vegetables used to have, you know, they used to have a stronger set of flavors. Particularly, a lot of green vegetables had a little bit of a bitter undertone, which was good. You know, it added to the flavor of the vegetable. And so many vegetables that had a nice bitter undertone, the bitterness has been bred right out of them. Okay. And like you know, rocket or arugula used to have a bitter undertone. Used to have a bitter undertone. Dandelions, if you go out and you pluck dandelions out of your lawn to cook with, they do not taste the same as the dandelions that you buy at the grocery store. It's just different. Again, Passover cookery, from my wife's experience, you know, lettuce used to be a bitter herb. Modern lettuce isn't bitter, but it used to be bitter. So these are all sorts of things you want to have in mind when you're trying to, you know, play with the ingredients. Is how can I get something that's closer to what we had originally? You know, so, and sometimes you can manage it and sometimes you can't. What do we got left?
We are at 4:58, and would you like me to stop the recording?
I think you should stop the recording at this point.